I'm Ethan Cooper, 33, and I build cybersecurity platforms for Fortune 500s. I grew up under my dad's old-school rulebook. He's Richard Cooper, 62, a lifer at the same local bank. His mantra was simple: real men suffer in silence, never take time off, and earn respect through grit. From day one, I was the black sheep. I chose tech instead of real work. By 28, I was clearing more in a month than he did in a quarter. Every holiday he'd smirk, "Must be nice tapping keys all day." Your sister's over at the hospital, saving lives. That sister is Lauren now, 30, a nurse pulling 40-hour weeks. She's the golden child he brags about. Respectful, dutiful, grateful. What he doesn't know is I quietly paid her tuition and erased her loans when she graduated. A few years ago, they hit a bump with their mortgage. I stepped in just for a while, set up an account in my name, and began the $2, $300 monthly payments. I kept a buffer of $35,000. Every transaction went into my private spreadsheet: principal, interest, escrow, remaining balance. I could have wiped out their debt at once, but I kept it gradual. Control is leverage. I never told them how it worked. They assumed I had money to burn. I told myself I was buying something you can't buy with cash: their respect. But every thank you turned into another silent expectation. This Father's Day was supposed to be different. I rented a tent in my backyard, hired a bartender, and spent over $2,000 on Dad's favorites: barbecue ribs, homemade lemonade, even that mac and cheese he loves. I flew Lauren home from Seattle and asked her to play peacekeeper. She smiled and said, "Let's do this, brother." On the morning of the barbecue, I tucked a custom-engraved Omega Seamaster into my jacket pocket, my $14,500 test of loyalty. The engraving read, "To Dad with gratitude." As guests arrived, my uncle, a couple of bank buddies' neighbors, I felt the weight of that box against my thigh like a live grenade. I caught Dad's eye across the yard. He was inspecting my flower beds. My heart hammered. I knew it was time to see if money could finally buy me something more important than a house payment: his respect. I held the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the Omega Seamaster's engraving burning against my leg like a brand. I didn't glance back as my driveway slipped behind me. All I could think about was the hollow split second when Dad stared at that watch and spat out, "You think money can buy respect?" I clenched my jaw, shoved the box back in my pocket, and drove away. The night air felt electric. My pulse thrummed like an engine revving at redline. I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. By dawn, my phone was a graveyard of missed calls and voicemails. Lauren, Mom, Uncle Rob, they poured verbal gasoline over me: guilt trips, threats, frantic confusion. I let the calls roll into voicemail jail. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table, loaded the mortgage spreadsheet: 30 months of payments, interest rates, escrow adjustments, all tagged in neat columns under my name. 2 clicks later, autopay was canceled. The buffer account sat empty of their mortgage money, $35,000 stashed in reserve. I hit confirm, heart banging. I leaned back and waited for the world to catch up. An email from First National Midwest Bank pinged minutes later. Upcoming payment declined. I stared at the subject line, vision blurring. By noon, a towering red foreclosure notice sign was nailed into my parents' lawn, a neon accusation glowing through my rearview mirror. I closed my eyes. That sign was more than legalese. It was a spotlight on my betrayal. I felt the gravity of what I'd done settle in my chest. That evening, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from my dad. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You embarrassed me in front of people who really matter," he said, each syllable landing like an icicle in my gut. "If you think you can rewrite who you are with cash, you're more pathetic than I thought." He paused, then added, "We'll see how long your generosity lasts." He sounded calm, but I heard the ice in his voice, and that terrified me. 2 nights later, I heard a knock at my door, 3 short, firm raps. I checked the peephole, a man in a black jacket, gray slacks, face obscured by shadow. I frowned, rooted to the spot. I'd never seen him before, but something in his stance screamed threat. He said, "Your father sends his regards," then turned away without waiting for an answer. My pulse spiked. I installed doorbell cameras the next morning, replayed the grainy footage, and recognized a face I'd only seen at holiday dinners. Panic rose in my throat. I called Natalie, my ex-girlfriend, the one person who still kept my number. She answered on the first ring, voice tight. "Some guy came to my office," she said. "Said he was handling a family matter. Tried to grill me on your finances, your mental state, if you ever talked about hurting someone." My chest constricted. This wasn't just intimidation, it was personal. I stared at the photo she texted, the same gray Charger in my driveway. I felt my stomach drop. That night, I sat in my living room staring at the watch box on my coffee table. The glossy black leather felt wrong in my hands. The engraved words mocked me: "To Dad with gratitude." Vengeance was a double-edged sword. I could feel its weight in every beat of my heart. Turning it over, I realized I had to decide to become the monster Dad feared or find a way to end this without losing myself. I closed the box and felt an odd, hollow thrill. The next morning, I rang the bank again this time to confirm they'd removed my name as an authorized payer. The clerk's voice was polite, distant. Yes, Mr. Cooper autopay is canceled. Her words echoed in the silent room as I swallowed hard. Relief and dread tangled in my gut. By noon, I'd filed a police report about the break-in attempt and the stranger at my door. As I recited the details to the officer, I wondered if I was unleashing something I couldn't control. By mid-afternoon, my apartment felt empty. The silence was a reminder that I'd burned bridges I might never cross again. I poured whiskey into a glass, the amber liquid catching the light. I raised my glass to an empty room and tasted freedom and ash. My phone lit up a text from Lauren. Can we talk? I stared at her name for a moment, then tapped her number. We arranged to meet that evening. Lauren arrived with steely eyes and a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She carried her own stack of documents, bank statements, old emails, voicemail transcripts. I found more, she said, voice low. As she spread her papers across my kitchen island, I saw Dad's handwriting on forged signatures, evidence of siphoned trust funds. A storm of emotions hit me, pride, guilt, relief. Her eyes were steady, but behind them I saw a storm gathering. That night, I checked my mailbox and found a single white envelope with no return address. I held it in my hand, fingers trembling, heart pounding like a wild drum. I didn't know what was inside, another threat confession, or something worse. I stared at it for a long time, then slipped it into my jacket pocket. In the hush before dawn, I realized I stood on the edge of a chasm, and whatever came next would either save me or swallow me whole. There was a letter in my mailbox with no return address, and I didn't know if I dared to read it. I woke before sunrise, the city still dark beyond my blinds, the envelope burning a hole in my jacket pocket. My apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge and the distant rumble of a delivery truck. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it, feeling my chest tighten. This paper was more than ink, it was a reckoning. My fingers trembled as I slid the flap open, half expecting it to explode in a cloud of dust. Instead, a single sheet of heavy cream cardstock slipped into my hand, crisp and unassuming. I unfolded it and read my parents' scrawled words, "You didn't know about everything." There's the rest. Meet me where the sun never sets. No address, no signature, just the echo of their guilt. My mind raced. What had I missed? I pressed the letter against my heart and realized I was about to choose between the truth and oblivion, and I didn't know which path I'd taken. I grabbed my keys and drove downtown, the streets still empty save for the odd taxi. I met Lauren at our favorite all-night diner, neon lights buzzing, vinyl stools squeaking under late shift workers. She slid into the booth opposite me, eyes red but determined. I handed her the letter. Under the yellow glow, her jaw clenched. We spread her banking records and the letter side by side, tracing the handwriting. It matched the faded scrawl on the Summit Educational Initiative's invoice. That shell company was only the beginning. Beneath it, scrawled in the margins, was a cryptic code, LSD 1986. The same letters that had surfaced in my grandfather's trust documents. Lauren's voice caught as she whispered, "They set this up 3 months after Grandpa died." I felt a cold knot in my gut. They weren't just stealing from us, they were orchestrating something bigger, something I was only now seeing in full. We moved our papers into neat piles, bank statements, trust documents, insurance files, and leaned in close. My pulse pounded as if preparing for a sprint. Lauren tapped her pen on the table. LSD 1986 could be a property code or a policy number. My phone buzzed, a missed call from Vance, my lawyer. I felt both relief and dread. Whatever this was, I needed a professional eye on it. I tucked the letter into my jacket and stood paying the bill without looking at the total. Outside, the sky was pale blue like a blank page. I tucked my hands into my pockets and realized I was carrying more than paper. I had a spear of evidence pointing back at my parents, and every step forward was a gamble. At Vance's office, the hall smelled of polished wood and stale coffee. His assistant led me into a small conference room. I laid out the letter, the code, and Lauren's files. Vance's eyes flicked over each page, lips pressed thin. He tapped the table twice. "This is intricate," he said. "The code, the shell companies, the insurance policies, it's all connected. We can file emergency motions to freeze assets, but we need specifics." My stomach twisted. Each new detail tightened the noose around my family's deception, and also around me. I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. Before we could plan the next move, I heard something at the door. Soft footsteps, deliberate. I glanced toward the corridor, pulse spiking, and realized we weren't the only ones who knew about LSD 1986. When I stepped into the hallway, the lobby was empty, but a soft click echoed behind me. A woman in her mid-40s stood at the elevator, arms crossed. Spectacles gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Her hair was pulled back in a tight knot. "Ethan Cooper," she asked, voice low. I tensed. She introduced herself as Rachel, an old colleague of my dad's, and held out a sleek USB drive. "He sent me," she said, tone unreadable. "Everything they planned is on here," my heart thundered. I accepted the drive, fingers brushing hers, cold, imperceptible. She slid away into the elevator without another word, leaving me alone with the drive and a dozen unspoken questions. I took Rachel's drive home and set up my laptop in the corner of the living room. A single lamp cast long shadows on the walls. I plugged in the USB and clicked through folders labeled with dates and acronyms: CP18, Sedona trip, Costa Rica, FP. My stomach churned. The final file was a video 16 minutes timestamped in a hotel conference room. I swallowed hard and pressed play. The recording showed my parents seated at a polished mahogany table with a suited lawyer half hidden behind a pitcher of water. My dad's face was stern. My mom's gaze drifted to the window. They discussed exit scenarios, beneficiary shifts, and double indemnity clauses. At one point, Dad leaned forward, voice low. "We'll disappear and the policy pays out. No estate to contest." Mom nodded, fingers tapping a pattern on the table. The lawyer spoke of offshore accounts, Cayman, BVI, and Panama. My pulse froze. My parents weren't just planning theft. They'd drawn up a blueprint for faking their own deaths. I felt bile rise in my throat as I watched Mom glance at the camera and offer a tight, knowing smile. I shut the laptop and paced the room. The Omega watch lay on the coffee table, absurdly beautiful and empty. Its engraving felt like a lie written in gold. I realized I had two choices: confront them and risk igniting something dark, or walk away and let them vanish under a corpse of lies. My phone buzzed a text from the bank's fraud department asking if I'd authorized a large transfer. It was time to act. My reflection in the dark window looked pale, haggard, but something behind my eyes had shifted. I wasn't just a son burning bridges, I was a man armed with proof, ready to expose the charade. I called First National Midwest Bank's fraud hotline and stayed on hold, listening to tinny elevator music. When the agent finally came on, I recited every detail: unpaid mortgage foreclosure shell companies, life insurance policies, offshore accounts, even the code LSD 1980. The agent's voice turned serious. "We'll escalate this," she said. I felt a fleeting sense of power, like I'd reclaimed a small piece of my story. But as I hung up, I knew banks moved slowly. Meanwhile, my parents were likely packing their bags. The silent clock on the wall ticked louder than my heartbeat. I opened my laptop again and drafted an anonymous tip to a local investigative reporter I respected. I attached redacted screenshots and a summary of the video. My fingers hesitated over the send button. If I pushed it, there was no going back. The cursor blinked. My entire childhood, my innocence, depended on my next click. I closed my eyes, pressed send, and felt a shock as the email disappeared into the digital ether. Within minutes, my phone lit up. "Is this legit?" "Call me," I texted a cautiously affirmative reply. Then I called Lauren. "They'll run with it," she said. "Journalists love a scandal, especially one with shifty bankers and faked deaths." Her tone was equal parts exhilaration and dread. We agreed to meet at my apartment that evening to gather everything: the letter, Rachel's drive, Lauren's records, my mortgage spreadsheet. At dusk, I drove to the outskirts of town, to the development on Lakeside Drive where the HOA had first raised its concerns. The gate was chained, foreclosure signs scattered across overgrown lawns. I slipped under the chain, heart pounding as if pursued. The house with LSD 1986 scratched into its mailbox number stood, empty windows dark. I crept to the front door. Splintered wood gave way under my hand. Inside, dusty echoes of lavish parties lingered in the air. On the dining table lay a dusty ledger with names I recognized: Summit Educational Initiatives, Heritage Future Planning, Family Legacy Solutions. Each entry was a $sign bleeding across the page. A sudden creak upstairs froze me. I pressed myself against the wall, breath shallow. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, approached the staircase. I reached for my phone to call Lauren. The floorboard groaned again, one step closer. My mind said run, but my feet stayed rooted. The symbol of the ledger, the coded shell companies, the watch in my apartment, they were all part of this web. And right now I was caught in its center with nowhere to hide. I held my breath, waiting for what came next. I froze as the floorboard creaked again, breath caught between hope and dread. The dim light from my phone screen spilled onto the dusty hallway, illuminating family photos knocked sideways on the walls. My childhood birthday smiles turned grotesque in the slant of the glow. My hand hovered over the doorframe, knuckles white. I knew I should run, but something deeper rooted me in place, the need to see this through, to catch whoever was behind the whisper of threats and stale lies. My pulse pounded like war drums as the steps drew closer, each one a challenge to my resolve and an invitation to act on the razor's edge of fear. The figure rounded the corner, stooped and cautious. Relief washed through me when I recognized Mr. Kruger Dad's old bank buddy, turned private investigator Vincent from the barbecue. His grizzled face was inches from mine before he realized I was there. His eyes narrowed, confusion mixing with shame. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, the old oak doorframe pressing into my back. "Nor should you," I replied, voice low but steady. "Tell me why you're helping my father pretend he's dead." His shoulders slumped, guilt flickering in the shadows. He glanced up at the broken chandelier and back at me as if weighing the truth. Vincent exhaled slowly, the heat of his breath warm against the cold wood. "He's scared," Vincent admitted, voice shaking. He thought if he vanished, the policy would set him free from everything debts shame the past. My heart twisted at his words. My father, the man who spat on my accomplishments, believed faking his death was easier than facing the man his son had become. I stepped forward, chest tight, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late to stop," I said. The silence that followed was thick with regret. Vincent looked at me, eyes wide with the weight of betrayal, and shook his head. He already booked the flight. The word flight hit me like a freight train, and everything I believed shattered. I backed away, stumbling over a piece of broken molding. Guilt and adrenaline tangled in my veins. If Dad was on a plane by dawn, every shred of evidence I'd gathered would become a eulogy, a post-mortem certification of his final betrayal. My mind raced. Confront him at the airport, call the cops, send Rachel's files to the reporters right this second. But each choice carried a price. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms, and let rage and sorrow fuse into action. I would chase him down. Whatever he planned next, I wouldn't let him escape. I thrust past Vincent into the foyer, keys in hand, and sprinted to my car. The engine roared to life before I even settled into the driver's seat. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, Vincent's silhouette framed by broken glass hand, raised in a half-wave. I floored the accelerator tires, spitting gravel. As the city lights blurred past, my mind replayed every insult my father ever uttered. "You'll never be a real man, you're nothing but a spoiled brat." Now every jab was a stake in my heart, driving me faster toward redemption or ruin. In the distance, the airport's runway lights blinked like silent witnesses. I punched the gas harder, willing the car to fly. The highway blurred beneath me, a ribbon of asphalt that cut through the night like a lifeline. I called Lauren on speaker, her voice crisp through the hum of the engine. "I found him," I said. She swore softly. "I'm on my way," she replied. In her tone, I heard both fear and steel. We hung up and I realized I was alone with the weight of this pursuit. My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. My palms felt slick. I pressed the gas pedal deeper, knowing each second brought him closer to disappearing forever. At the airport terminal, the buzzing neon of the departures board felt surreal under the cavernous roof. I reached the check-in desk as the agent tapped away. The screen displayed Richard Cooper Flight 347 to Costa Rica departing 6:15 a.m. My chest tightened. Costa Rica, the same place he'd vanished to before, a symbol of escape in our family lore. I swallowed the lump in my throat and leaned over the counter. "Can you stop that check-in?" "Hold that seat," I said, voice firm. The agent glanced up, eyebrows raised. "Sir, you're not on this reservation." Panic bloomed in my stomach. I fumbled for my wallet, proof of ID, proof of relationship, anything. My mind raced, fake ID, forged documents, an airport security breach. Was I ready to go that far? Suddenly, Lauren appeared at my shoulder, breathless. "I'm on his passport, call me a +1, she said, flashing her nurse badge with a wink. The agent hesitated, then sighed. "Fine," she said, swiping a finger across the screen. "Both seats are held." Relief and guilt warred in my chest as I exhaled, realizing how far I'd gone just to chase a man who spat on his son's watch. We hurried through security, adrenaline sharpening our senses. The X-ray belt rattled as my laptop phone and the Omega box slid through. My heart thudded as I watched the screen. No alarms. I breathed again. Side by side, Lauren and I sprinted down the concourse toward Gate 22. The final boarding call echoed through the hall, a pistol shot in the quiet. We skidded to a stop as the gate agent began scanning passports. My hands shook as I slid Dad's into view. She looked at his name, then at me and Lauren lingering behind. "Are you traveling together?" she asked. I nodded, voice steady. "He's my father. I need to talk to him before he boards." The agent frowned but scanned. A beep, then green. He was on. My chest cramped. I had one chance. I slipped past her and burst onto the jet bridge. The cabin door loomed fluorescent and final. I stepped inside. Rows of seats stretched before me, empty except for one figure in the last row, my father back to me. Suitcase upright between his legs. His posture was tense, shoulders hunched. My breath caught. Here he was, the man who'd taught me to suffer in silence, about to vanish from my life. Every instinct screamed at me to stop him, to beg forgiveness, to reclaim our story. I took a shaky step. As I cleared the last row, his head turned to gray hair catching the light. His eyes, once so cold, were red-rimmed, haunted. He looked like a stranger wearing my father's skin. I opened my mouth, but the words tangled. He exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding that breath for decades. "You came," he said, voice raw. The cabin felt impossibly small. The overhead bins loomed. The engine's hum felt distant. All my anger, my pain, my years of striving for a crumb of his respect, everything funneled into this moment. I closed the gap between us, heart hammering. "Don't," he whispered before I could speak. He lifted a trembling hand. My voice found me. "You can't erase yourself." The final boarding call boomed. "Board now or never," the gate agent shouted through the door. Dad's eyes flicked to the jet bridge, then back to me. "I'm done," he said. "I'm tired of being who you want me to be." Pain sliced through me, but beneath it, a spark of understanding. He was as trapped as I was by his beliefs, by his fears. I sank onto the seat beside him. The flight attendant approached, scanning our passports again. She glanced at Dad's tear-streaked face, raising an eyebrow. We nodded curtly. She moved on. The door sealed with a hiss. My father sank his forehead into the curve of his armrest. The seatbelt sign pinged on. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the watch box. He winced when he saw it. I set it on the tray table between us. "I sold it," I said quietly. "Sent the money to Lauren's trust." His head snapped up, shocked. Why, he asked. My throat tightened. "Because I need you to understand money doesn't solve everything." He looked away. I took a shaky breath. "We have to face this together." The plane lurched as the engines spooled. He closed his eyes. "I'm not sure who I am anymore," he confessed. My chest squeezed. "Then let's figure it out." The world tilted as the wheels lifted off the tarmac and we climbed into the unknown, father and son, bound by betrayal, searching for a fragile redemption in midair. I stepped off the small charter flight into the humid dawn air of Costa Rica, the endless horizon glowing like promise and indictment all at once. The sun hung low yet unsetting over palm-fringed runways, a living echo of that cryptic line, "Meet me where the sun never sets." My heart pounded with equal measures dread and determination as I wheeled our single suitcase through the deserted tarmac. Dad walked beside me, shoulders hunched beneath his crisp shirt, eyes fixed on the same fiery sky. In that glare, I saw both the man who'd sacrificed everything for appearances and the father who'd taught me to push through pain. Every fiber in me trembled. Was I ready to expose the final layer of his deception? Yet an unshakable part of me whispered that I had to see this through, no matter the cost. We drove into the countryside, the rental car's engine humming like a nervous animal. I traced the letter's words in my mind. No address, just a challenge. LSD 1986 was scrawled across the margins, and I'd learned it referred to an offshore dossier my parents set up under the sun-drenched guise of heritage future planning. As we climbed winding roads past banana plantations and cattle pastures, I felt the old conflict rise: duty to family versus duty to truth. The farther we drove from home, the louder my inner voice roared, "This is your reckoning." Dad didn't speak. His silence was a confession in itself. When we reached the gated estate at the end of a gravel road, the sign read, "Sol Eterno Trust Services." The gates creaked open as if they'd been waiting for us, and something in my chest clenched. What if this door hid nothing but more lies? Inside, a stone courtyard glowed under bougainvillea draped in hot pink. A woman in crisp linen introduced herself as Marisol the notary, handling trust dissolutions. Her desk held files stamped with codes like LSD 1986 and CR 2017, all pointing to a web of shell companies. She asked for proof of identity. I slid over my passport. Dad slid away his hands trembling as he produced only a faded driver's license. Marisol's eyes flicked between us. "Your authorization ends tomorrow," she said, voice soft as moss. "After that, these assets default to local coffers." I realized the gamble I'd made arriving after the window had nearly closed. Dad's face paled as he stared at her desk piled with legal binding papers. We had less than 24 hours to extract evidence, freeze accounts, and uncover where the real money had gone if it still existed at all. That evening, we slipped out under a sky so bright I could almost read by moonlight. The local banker Marisol had warned us about ran a branch office just off the main plaza. It was a squat building with barred windows and a single flickering lamp. I felt my pulse spike as we crossed the threshold. Inside, a nervous clerk ushered us into a back room lined with steel cabinets. Dad's voice came out strangled. "They've moved everything." My breath caught. "Moved," I whispered. The clerk nodded, sliding a plain envelope across the counter. Inside, a receipt for 6 wire transfers, 4 to a Wyoming LLC, 2 to a Cayman account, totaling precisely $178,000. My father's half of our grandfather's trust gone. He stared at me mouth open, and I realized I'd never seen him truly broken until this moment. We left with nothing but that cold paper trail, and I wondered how far I would go to reclaim what was ours. Back at our guest bungalow under an unending orange sky, Dad and I sat on the wooden porch, swing legs dangling above the overgrown grass. The night cicadas thrummed like a restless crowd. He clasped the receipt in both hands, eyes distant. "I thought I was protecting you," he murmured. "I never wanted to hurt Lauren or you." His voice cracked under the weight of a lifetime's pride and remorse. I swallowed the urge to snap back to shout that protection wasn't theft, love wasn't manipulation. Instead, I reached out and placed my hand over his. "You shattered us," I said quietly. "But maybe this ruin can be our foundation." His breath hitched, and I realized that the inner strength I thought was mine alone had been forged by his own suffering. The moon slipped behind clouds as we sat in silence, both of us wondering which fracture would heal first, his guilt or my anger. In the pre-dawn hush, Marisol arrived with coffee and a weary smile. She held an embossed folder stamped "Emergency Motion Asset Freeze." The documents inside authorized immediate legal action in multiple jurisdictions. Costa Rica, Wyoming, the Caymans, based on the evidence we'd provided. I felt a surge of relief and vindication. Justice was no longer theoretical. Dad took the folder, his fingers lingering on the embossed lettering. "The law can bind what loyalty never could." He looked at me, tears in his eyes that glistened like dew. "I'm ready," he whispered. Outside, the sky was turning pale, hinting at sunrise. But in that moment, the sun felt suspended, neither rising nor setting, just like us caught between endings and beginnings. With papers in hand and our fragile truce intact, we stepped into the dawn together, both haunted and hopeful, ready to face the consequences that would ripple far beyond this sun-drenched shore. I pressed my palm against the cool stone of Sol Eterno's courtyard, letting the lingering warmth of the unsetting sun seep through my fingers. The bougainvillea overhead twisted in riotous blooms, mocking me with its effortless beauty while I wrestled with every lie and betrayal that led us here. Dad sat on a weathered bench beneath the petal's shoulders, slumped wrists crossed like a man shackled by his own secrets. I slid onto the bench beside him, heart hammering, and placed Marisol's stamped freeze order in his lap. His eyes darted over the embossed letters: Costa Rica, Wyoming, Cayman Islands. I couldn't tell whether he was relieved or defeated. The silence stretched between us like a maw ready to swallow whatever hope remained. My fingers trembled on the edge of the papers. I knew that handing them over meant severing the last threads of our old life. He exhaled slowly, gaze drifting to the horizon that never set, and whispered, "You could have let me disappear." I folded my arms against a chill that wasn't there and met his eyes. "I couldn't let you vanish without answers," I said. His lips parted as if to lie, but no words came. All that hung in the air was the perfume of flowers and the weight of unspoken truths. We drove north that afternoon toward the Arizona border, tires humming like a muted drumbeat under a sky that felt too vast to contain our turmoil. The barbed wire fence marking state lines looked more like a divider between who we were and who we'd become. Dad stared straight ahead, knuckles whitening on the steering wheel as if gripping reality's frayed edge. I studied his profile in the rearview mirror, his jaw clenched in pain, eyes haunted by every humiliation he'd ever inflicted on me. At each roadside sign advertising, "Welcome to the Grand Canyon State." I felt a pang of irony. This man who'd lectured me about standing tall now seemed smaller than the landscape stretching around us. We pulled off at a crumbling rest stop. The bathrooms long closed, a single vendor's cart offering stale chips. Dad smoked a cigarette as I paced, mind racing through every possible outcome. Would the courts side with us? Would the local press catch wind of our scandal? He stubbed out the butt and looked at me like a boy asking for forgiveness. "What now?" he rasped. I brought my hand up to rest on his shoulder, surprising him with its firmness. "Now," I said, "we face the music back home." His breath hitched as if hearing that verdict aloud was the sharpest cut of all. Our first stop was the same bank branch Dad had once ruled with unflinching pride. The office sat between a pawn shop and a muffler shop on a highway that felt too quiet for the storm we carried. We presented Marisol's notarized motions, and the branch manager's polite nod felt like the soft click of prison bars. Dad's face went ashen when the manager announced an immediate asset freeze on every account tied to our names and those phantom shell companies. Employees whispered behind glass walls, casting furtive glances at the man who'd built a life on half-truths. As I watched Dad shrink under those stares, I realized how thoroughly he, and by extension, I had believed in a system that prized appearances over integrity. The irony stung. The same bank that once lauded his stoicism now questioned his honor. He met my eyes across the counter, mouth working like he wanted to say something, but pride held him silent. I reached for his hand and gave it a firm squeeze. "This is our chance," I told him, "to rebuild on something real." He swallowed hard, an inner tremor in his throat, and nodded, though whether it was to me or to that reckoning I couldn't tell. The following morning, we walked into the small claims courtroom together, our papers bundled in a manila folder like a shield. Dad's steps were hesitant, as if each footfall drove a stake into the old man he used to be. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, peered over her glasses as we took the stand. I felt my pulse steadied by a fierce resolve I would not be cowed again. The hearing unfolded in clipped formality. I read aloud the ledger of misappropriated trust funds, shell company invoices, forged signatures. Dad's trembling voice offered no defense beyond a choking apology. The judge's gavel fell like thunder. She ordered immediate restitution of remaining assets and imposed a conditional monitoring period on any future transactions. As the judge adjourned the court, Dad turned to me, eyes glistening. "I failed you," he whispered. My throat tightened. The old ache of years' worth of scorn threatened to flood back. I inhaled, feeling a new strength rise. "You did," I agreed. "But today you chose differently." The courtroom emptied, leaving us alone under the stained glass window where morning light painted us in fractured color. That afternoon, we stood on the courthouse steps as reporters drifted in, recorders held out like hands seeking bribes. Dad took a shaky breath and faced them, shoulders squared in a posture I'd never seen. He spoke without notes, voice wavering, but honest. I let outdated ideas of strength cost me my family. "I'm sorry to my son and to my daughter Lauren for every time I valued suffering over sincerity." His words cracked like fine china, but they held. Cameras flashed. Microphones leaned in. I watched him, a stranger in familiar skin, and felt tears burn my eyes. Tears for the man he was, tears for the man he'd become. When he finished, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the empty Omega box. He handed it to me, and I caught it instinctively, as though I could catch time itself. "You sold it," he said quietly. I nodded, voice thick. "I donated the proceeds to Lauren's nursing scholarship." He exhaled, a laugh caught in his throat. "You always did more good with money than I ever did with your respect." The reporters murmured, but their questions felt distant. For the first time, I felt something unbreakable bloom between us, a fragile bridge built from truth. Over the next week, Lauren flew in to stand by our side as we restructured Grandpa's trust under a proper fiduciary. We met with estate lawyers who spoke in languages of percentages and clauses, yet something fundamental shifted in each of us. We stopped talking about what was owed and started asking how to make things right. One evening, the three of us gathered around a small oak sapling in my backyard. Lauren's idea to plant new roots. We pressed our hands into the soil, feeling the grit and promise beneath our nails. Dad draped his jacket over my shoulders, his voice soft when he spoke. "A family that grows together survives any storm." I glanced at my sister, her eyes steady and bright, full of the loyalty Dad had prized but never earned. We stood in silence, letting the weight of our past trickle into the earth and hoping it would nourish something better. As the sapling's slender trunk swayed in the breeze, I realized that this gesture, planting a seed instead of sowing conflict, was the most radical act of faith I'd ever witnessed. A month later, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and the open court documents spread before me. The house felt quieter, softer, as if it too was learning to breathe after years of hushed resentments. I reread the final decree, all fraudulent charges, reversed assets returned to proper accounts, father and daughter, released from monitoring after a probationary period. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. Dinner tonight, my treat. I paused, recalling nights he refused to attend my birthday parties nights. I cried in the dark. But the man on the other end of that text was different. I typed back 8 p.m. I'll be there. The click echoed louder than his summons ever did. I closed the folder and stared out the window at the twilight sky, feeling the horizon's edge soften. The story wasn't over, it was finally ours to write. That evening, we gathered at a small downtown bistro that smelled of basil and history. Dad arrived first, clutching a familiar leather wallet, but with no watch on his wrist. His eyes flickered as I greeted him. I nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. Lauren slipped into her seat across from me, smiling with the easy warmth I'd missed for so long. Between courses of roasted chicken and farfalle, we spoke about work, about dreams, about the little things we'd never shared over our silent dinners. Dad told a joke about bank mergers, then paused as if tasting sincerity for the first time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slim wooden box. I braced myself another test. But he opened it to reveal a simple silver tie clip engraved with our family initials. Not a watch, he said, voice trembling. But a reminder that time can be measured by moments, not minutes. I felt my throat close with emotion. As I clipped it onto his lapel, I realized that symbol, small and unassuming, carried more weight than any luxury gift ever could. Later that night, I stood on my porch in the hush between midnight and tomorrow, watching the stars blink awake. The tie clip lay heavy in my hand, its cool metal a reminder of how delicate trust can be. I traced the engraved letters, imagining all the days ahead where I'd choose compassion over contempt. My phone buzzed a message from a viewer of my channel asking where the story goes next if families can truly heal. I stared at the words, feeling the last knot loosen in my chest. I typed back, healing takes time, courage, and the willingness to let the sun never set on forgiveness. The screen glowed in the darkness, and I realized the question wasn't how our story ended, but how it lived on in every choice we make and every truth we own. Story 2. My name's Julian Patel. I'm 28, and if you asked anyone in my family to describe me, they'd probably say something bland like, oh, he's quiet, or he works with computers, something tech. No one ever says Julian, he's extraordinary. That's been my role since I can remember the background character in my own family. I used to blame myself for this invisibility. Maybe I was too boring, too ordinary, too easy to forget. But over time, a pattern emerged. No matter what I achieved, no matter how many times I showed up or helped out, I was always overshadowed, especially by my younger brother, Ethan. Ethan's 25 now, not charismatic, effortlessly charming. In my parents' eyes, he could do no wrong. When he got a promotion at a trendy marketing firm, my mom blasted it all over Facebook, like he'd just brokered world peace. Meanwhile, when I quietly graduated with a master's degree in human-computer interaction while juggling a grueling full-time UX design job, they didn't even mention it at Sunday dinner. Not a single word. I sat there with a polite smile while the entire evening revolved around Ethan's new car and his big city lifestyle. I raised my glass and toasted him as I always did. That moment stung, but like every other slight, I swallowed it whole and kept going. But something changed last month, something subtle but irreversible. It started with an innocuous phone call from my Aunt Mira, a woman who somehow managed to sound chirpy and condescending at the same time. Julian, sweetheart, just checking you're coming to Ethan's graduation dinner on the 10th at that fancy steakhouse, right? Your parents are organizing it. Should be fabulous. I froze. The 10th, I hadn't heard about it. There was a pause. Oh, huh. I just assumed they told you already. Well, maybe it slipped their minds. Her voice trailed off uncomfortable. Bye. And then she quickly pivoted to tell me about her garden as if she hadn't just exposed a painful truth. I hung up politely, but inside my stomach sank. I dialed my dad immediately, keeping my voice calm. Hey Dad, quick question. Ethan's dinner on the 10th. Were you going to let me know? His answer, a casual shrug in verbal form. Well, Julian, we figured you wouldn't be interested. I mean, you just barely finished school yourself, right? This is more Ethan's moment. That line hit like a punch. But what twisted the knife was the laugh in his voice, like this was all a lighthearted joke we could laugh about together. I didn't laugh. I said simply, okay, don't worry about my graduation next month either. A long pause. Then, as if brushing away an unimportant detail, he replied, suit yourself. I hung up, placed my phone face down, and sat there in silence. And in that quiet, something inside me settled, not with anger, not with hurt, but with finality. I was done. Done being the overlooked son who kept showing up hoping for scraps of attention. Done playing the role of the invisible sibling. For days afterward, I lived my life as usual, work thesis revisions, helping my neighbor, Mr. Rahman, fix his old bicycle. But in my mind, a plan was taking shape, not revenge exactly, more like a quiet act of visibility. I wanted them to see what they'd chosen to ignore. 2 weeks later, while scrolling Instagram during my lunch break, I saw the photos from Ethan's dinner. My cousin Priya had captured every moment, Ethan holding court champagne in hand, surrounded by glowing praise and applause. My parents sat nearby, laughing proud. But there was one picture that stuck, a shot of Ethan leaning back in his chair, head thrown back in laughter while everyone clapped. It had 142 likes and dozens of "so proud" comments. None of them knew that while Ethan was being celebrated, his older brother was sitting at home writing a thesis that would win academic accolades. Unnoticed. I didn't dwell on it. The next morning, my university emailed to confirm my graduation ceremony, June 3rd. Outdoors on the main lawn, blue banners fluttering, folding chairs neatly arranged. The invitation form allowed 8 guests. I stared at that form longer than I should have. Then, without hesitation, I filled it out. My best friend Darren, my old professor who mentored me, my roommate Liam, who kept me fed during exam week, and Mr. Rahman, the neighbor who always asked about my classes and meant it. But not my parents, not Ethan. I didn't tell them the date. No announcement, no reminder. Just silence. 3 weeks later, under a clear blue sky, I walked across that stage. My name was called near the end, and as I stepped forward to receive my degree, I kept my chin high. My friends cheered loudly, my professor gave me a double thumbs up from the front row, and when the photographer snapped a picture of me shaking hands with the dean, I smiled like I meant it, because I did. What I didn't expect was what greeted me after the ceremony, a giant banner hanging behind the stage, my face on it blown up larger than life. Congratulations, Julian Patel, Master of Science in UX Design and Digital Strategy. Apparently, my advisor had nominated me for the Student Spotlight feature, and the university had turned it into a full-blown tribute. That banner appeared in every photo my friends took that day, and one of them my cousin Priya uploaded immediately with the caption, "Proud of you, Julian. Long overdue recognition." That's how my parents found out. 3 hours later, I had 5 missed calls from my mom, 2 from my dad, 1 from Ethan, and a single voicemail from my mother's sugary voice already tilting toward guilt. "Julian, why didn't you tell us?" I didn't reply, not then. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't need them to notice me, to feel proud of what I'd done. After the ceremony, I didn't rush home. I took the long way back, walking through streets still wet from a passing rainstorm, the air smelling of grass and concrete. I felt lighter somehow, but not in a triumphant way. It was more like the weight I'd been carrying for years had finally shifted, still there, but redistributed, manageable. That night when I got home, I laid the graduation program down on the kitchen table where Liam and Mr. Rahman were sitting, laughing about some ridiculous show they both loved. Without saying a word, Liam reached over, clinked his mug against mine, and grinned. "They saw that banner, huh?" I nodded, smiling faintly, but I didn't explain. Because it wasn't about the banner, really. It was about something quieter. Finally, I had taken myself seriously, and maybe that was enough. For a few days, I lived in that peaceful haze. I cooked actual meals. I read a novel instead of another technical manual. I even let myself binge-watch an old comedy series without feeling guilty about wasting time. But beneath that calm, something gnawed at me, a question that wouldn't go away. Why did my parents suddenly care now? What had changed? I had graduated before. I had accomplished things before, so why did this one moment break through their indifference? Then the twist came. A subtle one, but enough to make my stomach clench. Aunt Mira called me again, her voice unusually serious. "Julian, I shouldn't be saying this, but your parents are meeting with a lawyer this week. Something about future arrangements. I overheard your dad mention Ethan power of attorney. It didn't sound right. I thought you should know." The phrase power of attorney lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. I didn't even know there was an estate to manage, but apparently there was, and my absence from their lives might now be convenient in more ways than one. It hit me like cold water. Their sudden calls weren't about regret or guilt. It was about appearances and assets. I was no longer just the overlooked son. I was potentially an obstacle. That realization both stung and sharpened me. It was symbolic in a way how family could use visibility as both a reward and a weapon. When you're invisible, you're expendable, but when you suddenly become visible, you might be threatening. So I took action, not out of revenge, but self-preservation. Late that night, sitting at my laptop with only the hum of the fridge for company, I started pulling threads, old emails about the family home, a dusty file I'd kept from years ago when my parents convinced me to co-sign a loan for repairs on a cottage we supposedly co-owned. As I read through those papers now with clearer eyes, I saw vague language clauses that hinted at future ownership restructuring. Slowly but surely, they had been positioning Ethan as the sole inheritor without ever telling me. The deeper I dug, the more the puzzle pieces locked into place. The family home. They refinanced it with Ethan's name on the deed. The cottage by the lake listed in a trust that excluded me explicitly. I felt a rush of emotions, betrayal, anger, disbelief, but also a strange cold calm. This was no longer about hurt feelings. It was about standing up before they erased me completely. But I wasn't reckless. I contacted a lawyer, not a flashy one, but a meticulous, sharp woman named Priya Desai, a recommendation from Mr. Raman, actually. Over coffee in a tiny law office that smelled faintly of old books and sandalwood, she listened carefully as I laid everything out. She didn't gasp or shake her head. She simply asked one thing. Do you want to fight them, Julian, or protect yourself? The question was elegant in its simplicity. I answered honestly, I want to protect what's mine. And I want the truth clear on paper, whether they acknowledge it or not. Priya nodded and got to work. She explained that technically they couldn't just write me out without a clear legal process, and they hadn't completed it yet. Their planning was sloppy, built on the assumption that I wouldn't ask questions. That was their blind spot. Their Achilles heel wasn't cruelty, it was underestimating me. As I left her office, something caught my eye, a small brass statue on her desk. A seated lion carved with intricate detail. She saw me looking and smiled. My grandfather's. He used to say a lion doesn't need to roar to be respected. The symbolism felt uncanny. That lion became my quiet companion over the next few days, a reminder that I didn't have to shout to be powerful. In the following week, I gathered my evidence quietly. I requested copies of the trust documents through official channels. I flagged questionable transactions from my joint loan history with my father. Everything I had ignored for years because I didn't want to make trouble was now fuel for clarity and protection. Then came the next turn. Ethan showed up at my apartment. No warning, no call, just standing there in his designer coat, hands stuffed in his pockets, leaning against my doorframe like he owned the place. Can we talk? He asked, eyes flicking nervously over my shoulder, as if trying to see what I was hiding inside. I let him in, not out of trust, but curiosity. Sitting across from me at the kitchen table, he fidgeted with the coffee mug I handed him, but didn't drink. Look, he began. I know you probably think I'm part of this inheritance thing or whatever, but honestly, I didn't ask for it. I said nothing, watching him carefully. It's just Mom and Dad, they've always, seen me as the guy who could take care of stuff. I didn't know they were cutting you out. It was tempting to believe him, but his evasive gaze and nervous tapping told me otherwise. I finally broke the silence. Did you know they refinanced the family home in your name? His face paled for a split second. Just enough. That was all I needed to see. He was in on it, maybe not actively scheming, but complicit enough to benefit. Before he could offer some slick justification, I cut in my voice even. It's too late for explanations. I know everything now. I'm protecting myself. That's all you need to understand. His eyes narrowed, but he nodded once slowly, like a man who realized the game had changed. When he left, there was no handshake, no promise to stay in touch. Just a closing door and a deeper sense of resolve inside me. That night before turning in, I stared at my reflection and felt an unfamiliar steadiness. I wasn't just the overlooked son anymore. I was the son they couldn't ignore even if they tried. But I wasn't done. The next morning, Priya called with news. Julian, there's more you need to see. They've filed a motion to transfer full financial control of the cottage to Ethan. But they missed a detail. Her voice tightened with precision, a very important one. And that's when I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about legacy. And I was ready to fight for it. I sat in the quiet of my apartment long after Priya's call ended, her words echoing, they missed a detail. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I could feel the shift, a crack in their plan that I could pry open. For years, I'd accepted being overlooked, but now the stakes were higher than feelings. This wasn't just about being ignored at family dinners or forgotten at milestone moments. This was about being erased entirely legally, financially, symbolically. And something inside me refused to let that happen quietly. That evening, I found myself holding a small object I hadn't touched in years, a simple fountain pen that belonged to my late grandfather, the man whose name we all carried, but whose values seemed forgotten by everyone except me. The pen was heavy polished wood with his initials engraved at the base, RP. He had given it to me when I was 12 after I won a school essay contest. "You're my thinker," he'd said, then his voice warm and proud in a way my father's had never been. The pen had become a quiet emblem of the fact that once, just once, I'd been truly seen. I slipped it into my jacket pocket and headed to Priya's office the next morning. The streets buzzed with commuters and the low murmur of city life, but I walked calmly, almost serene. Priya greeted me with that same measured energy she always had, sliding a thick manila folder across her polished desk. Inside were the trust documents we had requested, but she had flagged one page, a page I hadn't noticed before, so. It was an amendment my grandfather had added nearly 20 years ago, long before his health began to fail. His handwriting, neat but firm, outlined a very specific condition: any transfer of property or authority required unanimous consent of both heirs. Both heirs, not just Ethan. It was a clause so old and so buried that my parents must have either forgotten it existed or assumed I would never care enough to find it. But here it was, a safeguard, a small but powerful legal thread left behind by the one family member who had believed in me unconditionally. And then in that moment, I felt his presence, not in some mystical way, but as a reminder of who I could be when I stood up fully for myself. The power dynamic had shifted. I didn't need to rage or yell. I didn't even need to confront them directly. All I needed to do was exercise my right to veto the transfer of control they had tried to push through without me. Quiet, decisive action, just like my grandfather would have done. But before we could act, Priya offered a word of caution. "Julian, this will force their hand. They won't be able to ignore you anymore, but they may retaliate emotionally. Are you ready for that?" Her tone was gentle but serious. I paused before answering. This wasn't a fight about money. It was about principle, legacy, respect, the social and familial contract they had broken. I nodded slowly. "I'm ready." The next 2 days were a blur of signatures and formal filings. Every step felt risky, not because the law wasn't on my side, but because this wasn't a courtroom drama. This was family, and family retaliation isn't always rational or predictable. Still, I moved forward. I gave Priya the authority to issue a formal notice to my parents' attorney, blocking the transfer and triggering a mandatory disclosure meeting for all parties. It was bold. It was confrontational in a way I'd always avoided, but it was necessary. That evening, Ethan called again. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity won out. His voice was tight controlled, but edged with irritation. "You filed something." Dad's furious. I kept my tone flat. "I exercised my right, that's all." There was a long pause. "You could have just talked to us first," he said finally, but even he didn't sound convinced by his own words. I didn't bother arguing. "You didn't talk to me about your plans, Ethan. You all made decisions assuming I wouldn't notice, wouldn't care, wouldn't act." "Well, I care now." His next words slipped out before he could filter them. "It's not about you, Julian. You've never really wanted to be part of this family. Not really." That line, casual but cutting, landed harder than he probably intended. Because that's the myth my family had crafted for years, right? That I was distant, cold, disinterested. When the truth was, I had spent most of my life quietly trying to belong, only to be met with indifference or polite dismissal. They mistook my restraint for apathy, but apathy was the farthest thing from what I felt now. I ended the call without another word. The next morning, a courier arrived at my door with an envelope, thick embossed paper with my father's handwriting on the front. Inside was a terse letter. No apology, no attempt at reconciliation. Just a request. "Let's discuss this privately. No need to involve lawyers any further. We can reach an arrangement, Julian. Don't escalate this." And tucked into the envelope, almost as an afterthought, was a check made out to me for an amount that felt both generous and insulting. A payoff. An invitation to disappear. I placed the check on my kitchen counter, weighed it in my mind for exactly 3 seconds, then tore it cleanly in half, the paper splitting with a satisfying rip that felt symbolic in itself. The check wasn't really money. It was silence. It was a return ticket to invisibility, back to the background role they'd always cast me in. Instead, I drafted my own letter that evening. Calm, precise, unambiguous. I am not interested in private arrangements. All decisions regarding the trust will proceed through formal channels with full transparency. This is not personal. This is about integrity. Please direct any future communication through my attorney. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a declaration of independence. I signed it with the same fountain pen my grandfather had given me, ink flowing smoothly on the paper. When I finished, I sat back and let the weight of that act settle in my chest. This wasn't just a response to their betrayal, it was a closing of a chapter where I had always accepted less, always stayed small, always hoped for acknowledgement that never came. And yet I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was clarity. For the first time, I was writing the narrative, not them, not Ethan, not my parents. And as I sealed the envelope, I realized this was only the beginning. Because a letter may be clear, but what happens when the people you send it to refuse to read between the lines? The days following my letter felt strange. Quiet, but not peaceful. Like the moment after an earthquake when everything looks intact, but you know the foundations have shifted. My parents didn't reply right away. No phone calls, no angry emails, not even a passive-aggressive text from my mother. A silence that felt louder than any outburst. I carried that silence with me everywhere on my commute at work, even while cooking dinner in the evenings, but I didn't mistake it for surrender. I knew better now. And then a week later came the twist I hadn't anticipated. Priya called me early one morning, her voice tight. Julian, they've filed a petition to declare you uninvolved and indifferent regarding the trust citing your past emotional distance. I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. My whole life they'd written me out of family events, treated me as an afterthought, and now they were using that very dynamic to try to erase me legally. The irony was almost poetic if it hadn't been so deeply calculated. Priya ever measured outlined our options calmly. This isn't just a legal move. It's strategic and psychological. They're betting you won't want to drag this through a hearing. They're hoping you'll blink first. But I didn't feel like blinking. I felt awake. For once, wide awake. We fight, I told her. Not for the money, for the record. Because that's what this had become, a battle for the record itself. To set it straight so that even if I walked away with nothing material, the truth would finally be visible, undeniable. In preparation, I began combing through old evidence. Photos, emails, texts, artifacts of my invisibility. There was one picture that stood out, my undergrad graduation photo, the one where I stood alone at the edge of the crowd while my parents posed beaming next to Ethan, who hadn't even graduated that day. And another, an email from my mother dated 3 years earlier, congratulating Ethan on a small promotion while ignoring the paragraph I had written just above it, telling her about my acceptance into grad school. These weren't bitter memories anymore. They were proof of pattern of neglect, of dismissal so routine that my family had forgotten it ever happened. I compiled them methodically, organizing them into a timeline that spoke volumes without embellishment. Each document was an anchor rooting me in my version of events, the one that had gone unseen for decades. At the same time, Ethan began reaching out again. Short-clipped texts that felt less like olive branches and more like reconnaissance missions. "Hey man, maybe we should talk," he wrote one evening, followed by, "This doesn't have to get messy." I didn't respond. His messages weren't genuine. They were attempts to read my hand to gauge my resolve. But I'd stopped looking for brotherly affection the day I realized he'd never stepped in, not once, while our parents overlooked me. What surprised me, though, was the emotion I wasn't feeling anymore: rage. The anger had burned itself out somewhere along the way, replaced by something calmer but stronger clarity. My actions now were deliberate. No need for melodrama or escalation. Just truth presented with quiet confidence. Then came the day of the hearing. A small conference room at the city courthouse, nothing grand or intimidating, just functional. My parents were there, sitting stiffly, side by side, dressed impeccably as always. Ethan sat next to them, looking vaguely uncomfortable but determined to play his role. Their lawyer, a silver-haired man with a polished smile, glanced at me once and then dismissed me entirely. As if I were still the quiet one they all remembered, too polite to make a scene. But I wasn't here to make a scene, I was here to stand my ground. The judge entered, her demeanor brisk but fair. She explained the nature of the petition and then turned to me first, inviting any statement or evidence I wished to provide. I spoke clearly, calmly, laying out the pattern. The timeline of exclusions, the documentation, the trust clause requiring unanimous consent that they had quietly hoped I would never notice. As I spoke, I noticed something fascinating. My parents didn't look at me, not once. Their eyes stayed fixed on the table or on their lawyer's notes, as though my very presence was still inconvenient, still something to be endured. When I finished, Priya handed over the neatly prepared file, the timeline, the emails, the photos. She said only one sentence to the judge, "Your Honor. This is not just about inheritance. It is about a pattern of disregard and exclusion being used as false evidence of indifference." That sentence hung in the air like a stone dropping into water, rippling outward. And then it happened, a moment so subtle yet so profound that I'll remember it for the rest of my life. The judge nodded slowly, flipping through the pages we'd submitted. She didn't look at my parents when she spoke. She looked directly at me. Mr. Patel, your position is clear. The court recognizes your equal standing as an heir and no transfer of authority can proceed without your consent. Just like that, the entire architecture of their strategy collapsed. Neatly. Legally. Without raised voices or slammed doors, my parents' lawyer muttered something under his breath. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and my mother? She finally met my gaze for less than a second, but that glance was all I needed. It wasn't anger in her eyes. It wasn't defiance. It was something much smaller realization. After the ruling, there was no dramatic confrontation in the hallway, no last-minute appeals for reconciliation. My parents and Ethan left in a tight cluster, whispering urgently among themselves. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. Outside the courthouse, the sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of rain. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in deeply, letting the weight of years roll off my shoulders. In my pocket, I felt the familiar shape of my grandfather's pen, the wood warm from the heat of my hand. That pen had become my quiet talisman through all of this, a symbol of being heard, even if only by myself. But even as I felt that hard-earned peace settle over me, I knew the story wasn't quite finished. Because legacy isn't just about winning or protecting assets, it's about what you build next. And as I turned and began walking away from the courthouse, my phone buzzed a message from Priya. You're free now, what will you do next? I smiled as I read it. The real question wasn't what I would do next. It was who I would become next.